Okay, so grade 10, this is another day, day number 3. We've got actually a number of people writing to me. Please do send me a message through either Google Classroom or send it to me by email, leo.s@buv.edu.vn. And I will try to answer the question. One of the questions, the first question I got was, thank you for the lesson, sir. Could you discuss the origins of inflation? Well, that's a good question. I'm not too sure if there was a day or a time where inflation actually first began. Anytime you have a situation where there's obviously more demand than there is supply, then the prices will go up. If there is a government that does not actually control the prices, then I suspect that prices will always go up. In modern times, certainly since World War II, we never really had a big problem of inflation in the West until probably the 1970s. And the 1970s, I think we talked about before, where there was a war in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the Israelis defeated the Palestinians, and a lot of Arab countries felt very angry that the West, or some countries in the West, particularly the United States, had come to the support of Israel, and for that reason they decided to create a cartel, a monopoly, a producer monopoly, and it was called OPEC. Okay, OPEC is the oil producing exporting countries. I think that's what it is. And for that reason, they decided to increase the price of oil in the about 1974 from about $3 a barrel to about $25 per barrel. And of course, everything relates to the price of oil, because whether it's bread or milk or anything, it has to be delivered, and the oil is used in that regard. So it meant that everything went up in price, and suddenly, for the first time in, certainly since the Industrial Revolution of the 1840s, you had a certain level of hyperinflation taking place in the West, mostly for what we call exogenous reasons outside the control of the producers. And for that reason, everything seemed to be going up. Workers were demanding higher salaries because of the greater inflation. It was really difficult for companies to be able to make a profit because they were not able to plan. There was a drop in investment. Most people would not put their money in the bank because the interest rates that you would receive was actually lower than the rate of inflation. I mean, if your rate of inflation is 50% and your interest rate that you're getting by putting the money in the bank is, let's say, 6%, then you don't need to be a rocket scientist to realize that there's a problem here, and that people will not actually, make money when there's such a divergence between inflation and the rate of inflation. So, to make a long story short, the economy sort of took a long time to allow inflation to work through the economy, but by about the 1980s, inflation had gone down to about 2.5%, and most people felt that the 1970s were a kind of a crazy era, and it hasn't really happened since. OPEC, the oil producing exporting countries, is less powerful today than it was. There's a lot of countries like Nigeria that has decided to opt out of the producer cartel. So for that reason, they don't have the same power that they used to have. Question number 2 was really about the amount of money that's actually held in central banks. The student says, I have read that many central banks around the world tend to buy and accumulate foreign currencies in their account. What is its purpose and how can it help economies? A really, really good question. Well done on that. They do, including Vietnam does it. I'll tell you exactly why Vietnam does it. As you know, Vietnam has a lot of foreign companies, multinational corporations working in Vietnam, and every month they want to take the dong that they receive from the customers, and they want to convert it into dollars and then export that money out to their shareholders, probably in the United States, but anywhere in the world outside of Vietnam. And what does that do? It always puts a pressure on the Vietnam dong. If you're trying to sell all these hundreds of billions of Vietnam dong from all the Coca-Colas and the KFCs and the Domino Pizza people, they arrive with their suitcases full of money to the bank, and they say that they want to buy dollars and they want to buy it using dong, then the pressure will be to lower the value of the dong and to raise the value of the dollar. And so for that reason, what you're finding is that at the end of the month, there's a little bit of a depreciation, and the Vietnamese government doesn't like that. They don't like the fact that their currency is a little bit unstable at the end of the month. So what do? In a very clever way, they use their foreign currency reserves, which is received from tourism or from governmental institutions that are selling properties, or they're selling things overseas, and they are paid in dollars. Even, for example, when Vietnam sells their rice to China or to anywhere that they want to sell it to, they will be paid in foreign currencies. And the government will take that foreign currencies and they're going to pay the rice farmers in the Vietnam dong. And so what it means is that the government ends up with quite a lot of foreign currency reserves, and that is really essential because things like oil and a lot of other products cannot be bought using local currency, and they, Saudi Arabia or whoever is selling the oil, they want, foreign currencies for that payment. So the Vietnam government will actually use those reserves to pay off any essential items that the countries will not accept the Vietnam dong as payment. The other one would be, as I just said, about the KFC trying to change all their dong into dollars. The Vietnam government end up buying their dong with all this foreign currency reserves. So as a means of trying to appreciate the value, in other words, to put it back to the original price, every month the Vietnam government, very wisely in my opinion, because stability in the exchange rate is really, really essential. And I would argue that Vietnam has the most stable currency maybe in the world, about 10 times more stable than the Canadian dollar, by the way. And so that's something that we all can be quite proud of, is how stable our currency is. Because if you look around even this area, whether it's Cambodia, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, none of the currencies are as stable as in Vietnam. So to answer your question, yes, they do have foreign currencies. They do use it for extremely important reasons, and for that reason I suspect it will continue long into the future. Okay, so if you have any other questions, please pass them on to me and I will be happy to try to answer the question on the next video. What I have done is we were just starting really the section on international trade. I think I've already sent to you this handout on international trade with this little diagram. If you don't have it, then I will put it into the not the Google Docs, the Google Classroom, so that you have a copy of it, so that if you need to download it, you can, so that we can really understand international trade in this section, okay? As I said to you before, chapter 4 is by far the longest unit in the syllabus. Macroeconomics is a super important topic, and international trade is a super important aspect of macroeconomics. There are some micro issues related to international trade, but on the whole, we would call it an issue related to macroeconomics. Okay, and as it says on the document, almost all countries other than autarkies, okay, now that's a cute word, okay? Most people, even at the university level, you say the word autarky and they don't know what you're talking about, okay? So that's one of these little key words that I want you to stick into your essays or on the exam to show that you know what you're talking about, that you're not just a student, but you're actually an economist as well. So an autarky is a country that basically puts most of its priority on self-sufficiency rather than international trade. Now, if you Google the word, you're going to find that it really means not trading at all, but that's unlikely that it wouldn't actually trade anything at all, but that by far it's not prioritizing international trade. And certainly a country like North Korea, where if you go to Pyongyang, you can see lots of big posters all around the country promoting this idea of self-sufficiency. They say, you know, we can do this by ourselves, we can grow enough food by ourselves, we can produce the products that we need in our factories. We don't need international trade. This makes us stronger. This makes us more independent. We don't need to bow down to anybody. And so the Koreans, the North Koreans, are very proud of this tradition of promoting a level of self-sufficiency that probably never exists in any other country. The only other time that self-sufficiency is, the order of the day is usually during a war, okay? Because it's almost impossible to trade. So Vietnam during the American War, trade was not a big priority, and therefore the government encouraged people to grow their own food, to survive on what they had, to be more self-sufficient, etc., etc., etc. And Winston Churchill did the same thing in Britain during World War II. Britain was being bombed by the Germans, and he turned it into a patriotic sort of song where he promoted the idea that if you love your country, you're gonna, start growing your own carrots in your garden, and you're gonna be self-sufficient, and we don't need to depend on foreigners. Countries like Switzerland, I mean, it's interesting because Switzerland is a very highly developed country today. During World War II, genuinely suffered because of international trade. And you can use this example in your essays or on the exam. Switzerland was a country that relied very heavily on international trade for almost everything, because Switzerland is a lot of mountains and they don't have a lot of agricultural areas, and therefore they would buy their food from Germany, from France, from Italy, etc., etc. And after World War II, what happened? They closed the borders, and then suddenly Switzerland was not at all prepared to survive as a self-sufficient country for about the 5 years of World War II. And people tell me, it's difficult to believe, but people tell me that there were even Swiss people who starved to death during World War II because there wasn't enough food. And for that reason, today, they have a policy of trying to rely less heavily on international trade than was the case during World War II. They never want to be in a position where they might have to rely on somebody else, because maybe there's going to be a war, and then before you know it, you're not going to have any food. So it means that if you go to Switzerland today, you'll find that there are gardens on the rooftops, and they have, people who have less than even 1 hectare. 1 hectare is 2.4 acres. And if they have less than 1 hectare, they have a little farm there. They have some pigs, and they have one cow, and it's unbelievably inefficient. But from the Swiss point of view, they don't want to rely on international trade anymore. They actually got kicked in the teeth during World War II, and they don't want it anymore. So certainly, Switzerland might be in that camp of potential autarkies, in the sense that they don't see international trade as really the solution to any of their problems. On the other hand, you have most of the rest of the world that believes that international trade is a huge solution to their problems. Okay? And they feel that this will bring in greater variety for the consumers, that the prices will come down, that utility will increase. In other words, the consumer satisfaction will increase. That most countries, look around, your bedroom or whatever, you'll probably find that most of the things that you see in your house probably comes from some other country. And if you look in the school, Chouvenin, you can look at the air conditioner, or you look at the lights or the projector or anything, even the desks maybe, they're probably not made in Vietnam. So it would be a big step for Vietnam to suddenly decide, oh, we're going to become an autarky. Now, they were somewhat of an autarky during the war, but we're not in war, we're in peacetime, and Vietnamese people are very peaceful people, and they want to gain from the benefits of international trade as well. So where does the theory of international trade come from? Well, you could argue that the international trade arguments came all the way back, to Adam Smith, and Adam Smith talked about it a lot in his books, and he sort of felt that this was a positive step. But the real author, you might say, the real writer is a guy called David Ricardo. You need to memorize his name. You need to stick it in there when you get a question on international trade, and you need to be able to explain exactly why is it that David Ricardo loved his international trade? Because he argued that not only does everybody benefit from international trade, he even took the extreme position and argued that everybody benefits equally, which is quite ridiculous, but this is what he believed. And so we can see today countries that have greater economies of scale, that are more advanced technologically, that have better transport systems, that have a more educated labor force, etc., to benefit more heavily in international trade. And so you can see that when you sort of look at countries that do well in international trade, like China, for example. China has a balance of payments surplus, where they're actually, the value of their exports are greater than the value of their imports, which is quite unbelievable. Canada's has a huge deficit. Vietnam has a little deficit. They do have a deficit, but it's a fairly small one in relation to their GDP. And you have to say to yourself, why is it that, David Ricardo believes so heavily in international trade? Well, part of it is that although he was British, he was actually originally from Portugal. He was a Jewish guy from Portugal, and he knew that in the 1830s, which is when he lived, that Portugal was a really poor country, and a lot of their economy was based on things like growing grapes and producing wine. And he argued that, because he put it in terms of religion, he said that God had given Portugal good soil and good weather in order to grow grapes. And therefore, they should specialize. And this is a key word for David Ricardo, the word specialization. He said that we need to specialize more in our wine production and forget about producing other stuff. Okay? And when he was saying other stuff, he was really referring to textiles from Great Britain, because they were the big producers of textiles, because they had a long history of textile production, partly due to the colonies growing cotton or wool from the sheep in Scotland, and also the industrial workers, the labor force that was relatively inexpensive, that was working in making textiles. Everything was suited for Britain to grow, but to produce textiles. And they couldn't produce wine if their life depended on it. Although today, if you go to Britain, you can actually drink British wine, but it doesn't taste very good. It's extremely sweet and kind of nasty tasting. But you will find that many people will argue that it is possible, but not very desirable, to be self-sufficient in something like wine in Great Britain. So what he said, it was factor endowments. That's a big word for basically he's saying that God was kind to some people and not very kind to other people. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, their factor endowments is obviously oil. And you could argue that in New Zealand it is sheep, because the climate and the history of New Zealand means that they are super duper efficient in producing sheep, but they don't know how to make a motorcycle if their life depended on it. And so with this argument, with the argument that is in your handout, it tells us that you have to analyze the differences in factor endowments of countries around the world. Clearly, every country has not been blessed with sufficient amount of all natural resources or climate conditions or soil types to produce everything that a country may need. This is particularly true for fossil fuels like oil, natural gas, and coal, although this may change as we move towards renewable sources of energy such as solar, wind, and hydropower. Oil exporters like Saudi Arabia will actually need to import oil by 2050, so the reliance of fossil fuels is what we would call unsustainable, which really means that this is not going to continue in the long run. Okay, so there are other issues as well. David Ricardo, he tried to justify international trade by things like referring to economies of scale, which countries could benefit from, that if you specialize, that you could actually suddenly make your products a lot more efficiently. He also tried to argue the case about providing greater choice and lowering the price of certain products and the benefits coming from specialization. He even gave the example in one of his books related to international trade about the idea of when you go to school, you don't try to study absolutely everything. You tend to specialize. Even this is 200 years ago, students would specialize in something that they would do well rather than trying to learn everything, and eventually you'll learn nothing at all, or you won't be an expert in anything. So I'm sure even yourselves, you know that you've got 4 A-levels that you've got to do, and some of you are thinking, oh, should I do only 3 and specialize? Should I be taking my math class when I'm not very good at math, or should I be taking economics if I'm not doing well in economics? Then you as well understand the benefits of specialization, that it's obviously better to get an A on 3 subjects rather than a D in 4. So he argued this case, and he sort of felt that this would bring about a lot of benefits for every country. He believed that countries would learn to innovate and to use a lot of money on research and development to try to make their products the absolute best. And that, as I say on the second page, politically, international trade is often seen as a policy that promotes peace and development in the world. McDonald's once argued that there's never been two countries that have gone to war that both had McDonald's in their country, which I don't know if that's true. That sounds like a really a weird example. It's kind of a funny example in some ways, but that's what McDonald's tried to imply, that they were a force for peace by saying that when you're trading together, you're not going to be killing each other. And that's been true certainly for Europe. If you know anything about European history, they've spent 1,000 years, if not more, killing each other and attacking each other and being pirates and stealing other people's property and other people's, they'd be kidnapping people and stealing things and going to war and accusing other people of being enemies, etc., etc. And then suddenly, when you have a free market and you're spending all your time trying to make money rather than killing each other, before you know it, Europe has become an incredibly peaceful continent, certainly over the last 50 years. And so the argument is put to the public that, international trade is good for everybody, not only to make money, but to lower prices, to increase the standard of living, your quality of life, peaceful coexistence. All of these things have benefited everybody. But suddenly we come down to the whole theoretical aspect of what David Ricardo is really suggesting. And we talked about this yesterday, I think. We talked about the dangers of being overly dependent on foreign trade, and certainly Switzerland felt that way. You have a number of other countries who, for example, Zimbabwe opened up their economy for foreign trade, and then suddenly everybody decided to buy only foreign products, and people lost their jobs, etc. A lot of people value foreign products more than their locally produced products. I'm not too sure why, but I think it's true today that, if you said to the average Vietnamese person, would you prefer to have a television made in Japan or made in Vietnam? Probably everybody would say they want a Japanese TV set. And that may not be very rational, but that is a reality of life. And so for that reason, a lot of people feel that, trading is really, really good. But of course, an over-dependence on international trade can be a problem when suddenly exogenous factors arise, such as the coronavirus. Okay, we were depending so much on Chinese tourists for employment and wealth creation, and then suddenly you have this crazy situation, and that now Chinese tourists not only don't come, but the Vietnamese government don't even allow the Chinese currency to be traded at the airport. So when you go to the airport, there's a big sign that says, they will not accept Chinese currency because of the coronavirus, which is unbelievable, but that is a reality of life. So certainly this has had a huge impact on the economy, and what could we have done to prevent that? There are arguments, and there's arguments, if I was a pro-autarky person, I would probably argue that when you are constantly trading internationally, that you lose a certain amount of independence, a certain amount of sovereignty. You could argue that your culture is threatened by foreign ideas and foreign foods and foreign products, and the fact that now people want, they think that, eating a Big Mac is cool over eating something else which is more local, like having pho soup. which is obviously a tradition in Vietnam, and a lot of people don't like it, and we have to deal with that analysis, that there is not always a perfect situation to replace, self-sufficiency. If you look on the third page, we go into a little bit of history about international trade, and it talks about how before Adam Smith we had this concept of mercantilism. Now that is something, again, you should use in your exam. That's a very clever word. That's a very economistic word. Only economists use words like that. And basically we're saying that during this era, in the I would say 1776 is when Adam Smith wrote his famous book, that basically most countries believed in the idea of maximizing their exports, minimizing their imports, and trying to accumulate as much gold, and I'm told as much silver as possible. And that's what their priorities were. And that's really all they thought about. And we have obviously moved on from there. We obviously believe in providing citizens with resources and shops and things like this, running businesses, and obviously the logic of only exporting and never importing. I mean, mathematically, this is a loser, okay? That how can everybody be exporting in the world and nobody importing? It's just not going to work. So what we have learned from David Ricardo is that by moving on from mercantilism, we have moved instead of trying to benefit from international trade. And I may be wrong, but I would say that almost everybody agrees with his original theories about absolute advantage. And we have that in the first chart that we have on page, I think it's 5, where we're dealing with England and Portugal, and you can see that England has 10 units of textiles and 15 of wine, and the Portuguese is 20 units of money will pay for the textiles and 10 for the wine. So what we learn here is that it's cheaper for, and it says cost per unit. So a unit might be, I don't know, a bottle of wine, or it might be a meter of textiles, a meter of cloth. That basically we're saying that England is more efficient at producing textiles because they can produce at 10 and Portugal at 20, and that the wine, the Portuguese can produce at 10 and the British or the English, I suppose in those days, would be producing at 15. And so the argument falls into place where the English should basically export their textiles, and that they should import their wine, and that the Portuguese should basically import the textiles and they should export their wine. And by doing so, everybody benefits. And I've argued this before, that this is a no-brainer. Most people would accept that. And I gave you the example of New Zealand and Japan, and I said that this is actually very logical, that that the New Zealanders do not have really any benefits in sort of trying to start up a new automobile industry because their population is so small. They have no history of that type of manufacturing, and therefore it would be definitely, they would lose money right away if they try to make a New Zealand automobile. Yet if they were actually producing what they do really, really well, which is raising sheep, then they could export sheep around the world and actually be quite prosperous doing so. It's not until it's not until he is criticized for suggesting that every country benefits from international trade, because his co-economists in the 19th century criticized him for suggesting that even poor countries would actually benefit from international trade. And the other economists would clearly state that, well, if you have nothing to be more efficient with, why wouldn't it be better just to be more self-sufficient rather than international trade? Because all you're going to do is import everything from overseas, which will be cheaper and better, and you basically will have no employment at home. And so this is where he came into the argument about ratios, and he would argue that, that although you are benefiting, let's say, in terms of, if one country produces everything better, but you're probably not producing everything better at the same ratio. In other words, if one country was, growing tobacco and television, then maybe Zimbabwe would be a little bit less efficient than Canada in growing tobacco, but extremely less efficient when producing televisions. And therefore, this would follow, according to David Ricardo, that you should trade all of your tobacco. Canada should trade all their tobacco and allow Zimbabwe to produce only tobacco, and then Zimbabwe should forget about producing television sets, and Canada would produce all the television sets for Zimbabwe and Canada. But as I have said to you before, it is an incredibly irrational suggestion to think that countries would be prepared to do so. In a free society, I promise you that farmers from Zimbabwe will never give up, or I should say, if tobacco farmers in Canada will never give up their tobacco to send it all to Zimbabwe just to be nice, when they're already being more efficient than Zimbabwe. And then the Zimbabwean television producers, who are quite happy producing televisions, maybe less efficiently than Canada, but they don't care about that. And so they are going to send all their land, labor, capital, and managerial skills for building TV sets over to Canada. Now, mathematically, it may work out that way. It might actually mean that everybody benefits from that type of shifting resources, that, Canada suddenly it becomes the television producer of the world, and Zimbabwe is the #1 tobacco producer because everybody is sending all their tobacco resources to Zimbabwe. But it's just never going to happen. It's never going to happen because, it's just not going to happen. I mean, people will not voluntarily give up their businesses just to help another country that maybe they've never even heard of before. But the government thinks it's a good idea. And that mathematically, that type of trade kind of increases the benefits to everybody. So, at the end of the paper, we have 6 questions. So this is actually kind of a homework-heavy exercise here. The first one is, was David Ricardo correct in his analysis of comparative advantage? Okay, now these are all questions from past exam papers, and so they're all very relevant. I would obviously argue no, but that's up to you. You can decide whether you want to say yes or no, and how you want to answer it. The next question being, why do many economists promote the merits of international trade? So, things like bringing down prices, more choice, that sort of thing, that would be part of your answer. Question number 3, are there disadvantages to international trade when compared to an autarky? And we've talked about that already. We mentioned things like, the lack of independence, losing your culture. Is it really necessary to have international trade, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, there are. It's part of this handout that I have that you just read it carefully, and there'll be lots of arguments kind of in favor of autarkies over international trade. Are there solutions to a deteriorating terms of trade? Okay, terms of trade, we've talked about this before. Terms of trade is clearly an issue related to the value of your exports over the value of your imports. So countries that have, let's say in Vietnam, we import oil, but we export rice. So it means that if the price of oil goes up quicker than the price of rice, what are we going to do about that? Okay, so I mean, we've talked about this before, but we're saying that, for example, in the terms of trade, that you could start trying to export higher quality products. I mean, tourism is an example of an export as well. You could try to encourage greater, a richer tourists who will spend their holidays in five-star hotels. I think I sent you an article about coffee and how Vietnam is now trying to sell processed instant and decaffeinated coffee to increase the value of their exports. There's lots of examples out there of countries that are trying to increase the value of their exports. Zimbabwe in trying to sell cigarettes rather than bulk tobacco, so this would actually increase the value of their exports. And then trying to decrease the value of the imports. So obviously if it's something like oil, then you need to probably import less oil, so maybe a conversion to solar power, wind power, hydroelectric power, this sort of thing would mean that we wouldn't need so much oil as we did before, and therefore the total cost of importing oil into the country would be less because we're actually importing less oil. So that would probably be the way to answer the question about, solving a deteriorating terms of trade. So deteriorating means that, you're having more and more a problem that the value of your exports are going down in relation to the value of your imports. And obviously that's going to cause debt issues and other problems as well. What is dumping and why is it such a controversial issue in American-Chinese trading relations? Okay, we talked about that a little bit already. Dumping, where you're actually selling products lower than the cost of production. I gave you examples in the classroom where we talk about things like, you can go to a big warehouse, supermarket type of thing, like Walmart in the United States, and buy a table for $1 and a chair for $1. And there's just no way, there is no way that anybody could produce a table and then transport it, and then pay the taxes and to give Walmart a profit and et cetera, and delivering it for $1 for a table. It's just not going to happen. And therefore, the United States probably quite correctly suspects that there's a bit of dumping going on. And China may decide that they want to dump because they want, more American dollars. Maybe they want to destroy the local furniture business so that they will have a monopoly in furniture production. There could be many, many reasons for dumping, but the international, what's it called now? The World Trade Organization, the WTO, which monitors things like dumping, have a real problem in convicting countries like China of dumping because it's very difficult to prove. And so for that reason, China probably will get away with it for another 1,000 years because we have no idea how they can produce a table for $1. The Chinese defend themselves by saying, hey, we're just more efficient in producing tables than you guys are. You need to get your act together and become more efficient in making tables, and then you will be able to compete with us. And of course, the Americans say that's not possible. We cannot compete at that type of level. And finally, and this is probably going to end up being a debate that we're going to have to organize. Is protectionism preferable to free trade? This is really important. We're going to have to go over this quite a bit. The whole arguments over protectionism. Protectionism is really things like anything that restricts trade, such as taxes, import taxes, or quotas, or medical restrictions, such as there was a mad cow disease in France, or I should say in Great Britain, about 20 years ago, and so the French made a law that said that no beef from Great Britain can be imported into France. Now, was that because the French were concerned about health, or was it because they were trying to help French farmers? And so a lot of British farmers believe that this was an example of protectionism, which is actually illegal according to the EU. You're not allowed to be protectionist. You're not allowed in the EU or the ASEAN countries or NAFTA to bring in things like taxes, import taxes or quotas or anything like that. The idea of a free trade zone is that it is a free trade zone. So in Europe or in North America or in the ASEAN countries, that products and services should be traded without any restriction whatsoever. So anyways, there are 6 questions that I want you to work on. If I didn't send it to you, I'm going to send it to you now. I'm going to send you the handout so that you have it with you when you go over this video. Again, I would recommend to you to try to save this video onto the hard drive of your computer, put SS in front of the Y of YouTube, and then push enter, and then push OK, and then it will automatically save the video onto your computer. So I think that's all for today, and I wish you luck, and I hope that this coronavirus comes to an end as quickly as possible, but we're trying our best to compensate for a very difficult situation. Keep your questions coming. I love answering questions, whether they're good or bad or hostile or friendly. That's okay. I don't mind. I've got a pretty hard skin, as they say, and I'm just looking for a bit of interaction from all of the students. So until next class, bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.